This is American Political Thought, and this is our last module on the material from Storing's What the Anti-Federalists Are For. And what you should have in front of you is the comparogram and also the notes. What I want to do is now walk through the primary differences between the Anti-Federalists, having seen their commonality in both the nature of human beings and the end of government and the tasks which living under government, the problems, the perennial dangers of government, which they shared in the first column, and why they both agreed that Republican government was the best solution or the best approach to those problems. And now what we'll do in this discussion is see why they came to profoundly different understandings of what Republican government is and what it requires, and then I'll turn to my notes to kind of summarize Storing. And you'll see, by the way, to some degree, this will also set up the basis for de Tocqueville in a couple of weeks. Next week, we're turning to the question of slavery and the founding. We're going to be discussing the Willentz book and another article by Storing, interestingly enough, called Slavery and the Moral Foundations of the American Republic, which makes a shocking and interesting and radical argument, as you will see. So anyway, if you have the comparogram in front of you and also the Storing book, let's begin. So if we're looking at the third column, let me actually preface this with some of the observations from both Chapter 3 and 4 on the nature of the Union. Because again, you could say that on one level, Anti-Federalists and Federalists shared the idea that America's existence required some kind of national union. But of course, the Anti-Federalists favored, as we saw in the Articles of Confederation, a union in which the American Union consisted of sovereign states, in which the individual Americans did not constitute or were not represented, and the laws of which did not act upon individual Americans in their states. It's more or less like the Confederation of the United Nations. And in some ways, it's a good thing to start off with that. If you turn to 15. So the Anti-Federalists' defense of federalism and the primacy of the states rested upon their belief that there was an inherent connection between the states and the preservation of individual liberty, which is the end of any legitimate government. Again, that's something that both agreed on, that the end of legitimate government, which begins in consent, but legitimate government has to preserve people's liberties and let them hang on to as much natural liberty as they can, consistent with living in civil society. And let me just say again that balance point between how much liberty you retain and how much you give up for the purpose of society, we saw that sharply adumbrated in the last year in the debate over the pandemic. So what I want to do in our initial comments, before we actually dive into the four claims of the Anti-Federalist position, was to just reinforce why they argued that the Union had to be a confederal one of equal sovereign states. And part of that has to do with, as you'll see, because they argued that you could only take Republican government so large in terms of size. On the bottom of page 15, why must the essential business of government be done by government units like the states, which in the Anti-Federalist form of thinking were small republics, pretty big republics? And as Storing points out, even Anti-Federalists were forced to admit that the American states were bigger than many European countries, and certainly larger than most of the small republics. And you could say that, again, the Anti-Federalists look back to Rome, and they said, well, once Rome became this giant so-called imperial republic, it could no longer hold on to its republican forms, and right around the time of Julius Caesar and Augustus Caesar, the regime changed into an empire run by an emperor with the paper senate, so to speak, and the people still technically involved, but with a good deal of the government of the empire run by a vast and sometimes unforgiving and extensive imperial bureaucracy. So that's what the Anti-Federalists saw, the threat of the Constitution. So to go back to this nice quote on page 15, why must the essential business of government be done by governmental units like the states? Primarily this was, in the Anti-Federalist view, a question of size. It was thought to have been demonstrated historically and theoretically, and this, by the way, goes back to his characterization of the Anti-Federalists as conservatives. An Anti-Federalist thought that the Constitution, which it was, by the way, represented a novel and dangerous experiment, an untested experiment in government. And it did possess political novelties never seen among the human condition. One of them being the huge, diverse republic of factional self-interest that Madison describes in Federalist 10, and that we'll come back to. The argument was that sorry, Frozen, my cat, who is not my cat, suddenly demanded attention. Anyway, so again, remember, they were conservatives in the sense that they argued that history and prior Republican theory had shown that republics could only exist true to Republican form if the purposes of Republican government obtained on a small scale. It was thought to have been demonstrated historically and theoretically that free Republican government could extend only over a relatively small territory with a homogeneous population. And you'll see this theme will pop up both in the arguments for and against the great diverse national republic and the Anti-Federalist opposition to it. Yet no genuine equality of government is possible in such a large state, and so forth, and you can follow the argument there. And in particular, here's a nice statement. It's from chapter 4 on the nature of the Union. Again, the Federalists arguing for the creation of a vast, huge, diverse, extended republic over a huge amount of territory and population, in which the members of the Union would be the American people represented in the national government. And again, the Anti-Federalists arguing that only a small union of equal states, or a confederal union of equal states, and you'll see, by the way, that part of it is the argument is, if the states give up essential sovereignty, then they'll lose all control over the voracious tendencies of the central government. And of course, as Storing points out repeatedly, that's why the Anti-Federalists had the weaker argument. Because if you have a confederation of jealous states protecting their sovereignty, you'll never get anything done. They'll come, and as in fact that was the record of the Articles. You couldn't conduct foreign policy, you couldn't raise money, you couldn't regulate commerce, and therefore, as Hamilton says in Federalist 22, the Anti-Federalists are trying to reconcile contradictions. They want contradictory things. They want a nation, but they will not consent to a national government. But if you don't have a national government, you're not going to have a nation. That was the strongest argument that the Federalists made. And the Anti-Federalists, as Storing points out in the last chapter, or in chapter 4 too, is it's not so much that the Anti-Federalists, you can't say this because they were often diverse, but no, they said to this. Okay, we have a nation, and that probably needs something like a national government. But the Constitution goes so far in the direction of consolidation and national administration that at least if we gotta have a national government, let's make sure that it's strictly limited and can't absorb through centralized administration all of the powers of the states and turn into an empire. So, and as you'll see on page 31, there's also another statement. It wasn't just that they disagreed on the nature of the Union. In Federalist 11, Hamilton, and if you've had me for American government, we read this, and Storing refers to it occasionally. Federalist 11, which, for the attentive of you, comes right after Federalist 10, makes the argument that if we have a strong national government, we could have a giant national revenue, we can have military strength and naval power, we can regulate commerce and create a national prosperity unlike any other nation, and even aspire to a national greatness, as he concludes at the end of Federalist 11, that will vindicate the honor of the rest of the human race, Asia, Africa, and America, from European domination. And the Anti-Federalist response wasn't just a disagreement about the structure of the Union. It was a disagreement of, it was kind of a response to that Hamiltonian argument. Indeed, the stress, this is on the bottom of 30, let me actually, the core quote's on the bottom of the paragraph on the next page. Indeed, the stress placed by Federalists on national defense and a vigorous commercial policy seemed to mask a radical shift in direction from the protection of individual liberty to the pursuit of national riches and glory. When the Anti-Federalists saw the new Constitution defended as having the noble purposes that make us respectable as a nation abroad and rich as individuals at home, and is calculated to promote the grandeur and importance of America until time shall be no more, they feared for the principles of American government. Quote, "You are not to inquire how your trade may be increased," Patrick Henry warned, the great Patrick Henry. Quote, "Nor are you to become a great and powerful people, but how your liberties can be secured, for liberty ought to be the direct end of your government." So the Anti-Federalists were aware of the temptations of powerful national government, and that ultimately commercial prosperity, naval strength, military power, and even greatness would override the devotion of Americans to their own liberties. They would see, and we're going to come back to this in de Tocqueville, who saw the modern world contending between two different versions of democracy, a radicalized, centrally administered one with radical egalitarianism, and a moderate American one with administrative decentralization. I've already pointed to that passage at the end of Volume 1 that I read to you in the introductory lectures. And I have to say that if the Anti-Federalists were alive today, they would see our competition with China as exactly making their point. Here, China in one generation, through its unique mixture of a free market which allows people to pursue their individual wealth-generating tendencies, which only capitalism can do, they've managed to combine it with a tyrannical and authoritative central government, which, by the way, has erected the greatest supervisory state in the history of humanity. It makes Big Brother in 1984 look like a kindergarten. And you could say that to some degree what the Chinese leaders of the People's Republic of China would say to the people is, we're going to tell you what to do, but on the other hand, we're going to become the greatest nation in the world, the most prosperous, and we're going to run the Americans into the ground. Because those people are so involved in their whiny individual liberties that they can't act on the common good in their own country. It's falling apart, and we are going to overtake them. If the Anti-Federalists were here today, they would say, see, you want to be China or you want to be America? And who cares if China is the most powerful and prosperous and militarily strong nation in the world? Your business is to preserve your freedom. So this highlights Sterling point. You may or may not agree with my characterization of the People's Republic, but the idea that the aim of American Union is not national greatness or commercial prosperity. Now, by the way, nobody wants to be poor. Nobody wants to be weak. Nobody wants to have Canada directing our foreign policy. God forbid. Canada. But would you rather be prosperous or free? If it's an either or, the Anti-Federalists said, better that we should be a humble and somewhat impotent nation in the world stage, which, of course, as you can tell, has some costs. I mean, after all, would America have been able to fight in World War I and World War II or conduct the Cold War if we had the economy of a Canada? Even though Canada itself is a huge country, but it has a tiny population compared to America. All right, so my point here is that to frame the Anti-Federalist arguments for the small republic, it helps to see them against the larger debate about the nature of the Union, confederal versus national, and the aims of national union that Storing talks about. So let's now examine the four core aspects of anti-federal thought. And I've actually taken Storing's statement from page 16, where I summarized these and used them earlier. The advantages were voluntary attachment and voluntary obedience to the laws, a genuine responsible of the government to the governed, and this is on the top of 16, and a small republic can form the kind of citizens. I've actually kind of taken those three things and morphed them into 4 points of comparison, and you'll see why. So the first one, if one of the great advantages of Republican government is that it rests on not a consent at the founding, but consent in the daily operation of the government, that the people voluntarily obey the laws because they've had a part in them, not because an imperial power enforces them on them. But it's like speeding laws. I know I don't have the best record in the world in absorbing speeding laws, but I vote for legislators, both on the state and national level, that set speeding laws. In voting for our representatives, we're actually, even if you disagree with certain laws, nevertheless you were represented in them, and that's the argument for Republican government. If those of you who had great parents, occasionally, that parents have to whack their children and beat them over the heads with logs and baseball bats and lock them in the closet and don't change the straw. Just kidding. But we all know that more successful parents are ones who educate their children and train them in their liberties rather than treat them like cringing dogs. So if that's true, then why does it have to be small? And here's a nice statement on page 16. Starting at the top of the paragraph on the bottom of the page 16 and continuing in the middle. The dependence of any Republican government on the confidence of the people was one of the reasons given by the Nationalists in the Constitutional Convention, nobody James Houston presenting the argument, the Federalist argument, for resting the general government directly on the people. The Anti-Federalists emphatically endorsed this principle. Quote, the great object of a free people, the federal farmer argued, who was an Anti-Federalist, must be so to form the government in laws and to administer them as to create a confidence in and respect for the laws, and therefore induce the sensible and virtuous part of the community to declare in favor of the laws and to support them without an expensive military force. Now, we all need cops. We all know that. No matter what you think about the police, we need the police. Perhaps they need to be reformed or whatever. But the point is, it would be better to have a people obeying the laws, not because they're terrified of a tyrannical government, but because they see the common sense of the laws and agree to obey them, even if on the individual level they don't always do that so well. So, and then this goes to the second one, the rule of law, which I kind of teased out as a separate point of comparison. Rulers, like citizens, must act on the common good as the transcendent and ennobling activity product of rational beings. We saw that reason is the part of the human consciousness that sees generalities, and a law is a generality. And therefore, if you're talking about governmental policy approaching the common good, doesn't that happen more likely in a system where policy is based on laws that have the confidence of the whole people, that express the generality of the common good and a rational principle, and in which people obey them voluntarily? Now, there's a response to that as to what law is, and you'll see this. And in my Congress class, this is what we're examining, what I call the Madisonian legislature, and more about that in a bit. Third, the argument was only in a simple, small government. And if you had me for American government, the Anti-Federalist, who was quoted throughout Storing's book that I use in the Nichols Reader, was Sentinel, who was a Pennsylvania Anti-Federalist. So only then could you have knowledgeable, attentive citizens, accountable and knowable representatives. Look on page 17. The general rule is that government must exist, if not by persuasion, then by force. In a large empire, standing armies aren't. But that goes back to the other point. So further down on the page, quote, thus, a full and equal representation is that which possesses the same interests, feelings, opinions, and views the people themselves where they were all assembled. According to Melancton Smith, one of the primary Anti-Federalists, representatives, quote, should be a true picture of the people, possess the knowledge of their circumstances and their wants, sympathize in all their distresses, and be disposed to seek their true interests. This describes the state legislatures reasonably well, it was claimed, but the federal legislature could not even come close to being representative of this genuine sense, at least not without a sharp increase of its number. In the Congress class, we looked at Madison's arguments in the Federalist Papers in the 50s on on how to guarantee what representation was, etc. But here the point is, only if the community is small and relatively homogeneous, and we'll come back to this theme of homogeneity, do the people know the representative. They know who's been diddling on their wives, or who's been embezzling at the bank, and who doesn't mow their yards, because they live there. And with a small number of local representatives, the people are more capable, this is Sentinel's argument, of watching their representatives and keeping track of them. If one of the great advantages of Republican government is that it holds the rulers more responsible to the people through election, then how is this best done? In a small scale where the representatives look like the people they are elected by, and where the people are homogenous in society, understand their interests as a whole, and can supervise and understand the representative. A federal class of representatives who are professional and serve for decades is something, in some ways, by the way, that both Federalists and Anti-Federalists would see as abhorrent. And in my Congress class, you will see that that's the way that you raise the question of whether the contemporary Congress, where people are elected and generally for repeatable terms, the issue of incumbency has become an issue of debate. Last, virtue. And this we'll see, this is the deepest and most insightful point, according to Storing, about what the Anti-Federalists saw. So if you turn to page 19, they thought that, and let me read a couple of comments, take us through a couple of things, and then we'll summarize this. Remember, in order to have a good society, the government really has to be attached to the common good. And that means it takes a certain kind of citizen with a certain kind of character who habitually not only is capable of looking beyond his or her self-interest and seeing the common good, but then actually caring about the common good. It's an aspect it's a cognitive issue of knowing the common good, and an affective, not effective, affectional, that in order to produce the common good, you have to have people willing to walk into battle and die for their country. And they have to love their country. They have to love the common good, so that in their living room when filling out an honest tax return, and the question comes, can I break the law and get a tax advantage, or should I be a good citizen and fill an honest tax return out? The hope is that you're creating a nation of citizens who know, see, and love the common good, which takes a certain kind of character. And this is the virtue of the civic republic. Look on page 19. The third part of the Anti-Federalist defense of the small republic concerned the kind of citizens a free republic needs. The Anti-Federalists emphasized repeatedly that the character of a people is affected by government and laws, but that relation had been dangerously ignored in the framing of the proposed Constitution. In the words of Melanchthon Smith, government operates upon the spirit of the people as well as the spirit of the people operates upon it. And if they are not conformable to each other, the one or the other will prevail. Our duty is to frame a government friendly to liberty and to the rights of mankind, which will tend to cherish and cultivate a true love of liberty among our citizens. Further on the bottom of the page, an even more pungent and cogent quote. A Republican citizenry must be free and independent-minded, but it must also be homogeneous. In a republic, the manners, sentiments, and interests of the people should be similar. If this be not the case, there will be a constant clashing of opinions. And as you'll see when we turn to the Federalist version of this, in Federalist 10, Madison says, yeah, come on, let's go for it. The multiplication of the diversity of factions. And we'll see why, because as Storing points out, there was one great defect to the Anti-Federalist position, which even if you buy all their other arguments, they never fully had a good response to that. And that is, as we'll see, not only here in Storing and in the Federalist Papers, and if you've had American government or constitutional law, you know this argument from Federalist 10. And de Tocqueville becomes the great theorist of this issue, and that is democratic majority tyranny. And we'll see how this becomes an issue. Clashing opinions in the representatives of one part will be continually striving against those of the other. Okay. By the way, and on the next page there's a good quote. Let's look at that. 28. Homogeneity implied for the Anti-Federalists not only likeness, similarity, but likeness of a certain kind. A society in which there are no extremes of wealth, influence, education, or anything else to the homogeneity of a moderate, simple, sturdy, and virtuous people. Republican government depends upon civic virtue, on a devotion to fellow citizens and to country so deeply instilled as to be almost automatic and powerful as the natural devotion to self-interest. Remember, both Federalists and Anti-Federalists, and this is the crux, I think, we've reached perhaps the deepest point of division. Both agreed by the principles of the Declaration, the image of human nature, that man is essentially, as a natural being, as a self-interested creature, and the conflict of which ultimately leads to the creation of government. But the problem is then, once government exists in society and the common good becomes a measure of the good of society, the natural tendency of human beings is not to pay attention. It's to lapse into an attention to their own private interests. And you're going to see, I'm going to summarize it in one sentence. The Anti-Federalists saw this and thought you had to construct a society so that in its habits and inclinations, it covered that natural inclination up with a layer of civic virtue. You can't change human nature, and the Anti-Federalists didn't think that. But what you can do is you can create a set of social constructs and laws and institutional operation that teaches people how to be good citizens, and that means overcoming their very own strongest inclinations. As we're going to see, the Federalists argued people are selfish. The Declaration says you're entitled to your selfishness and your freedom. Let's run with that. Instead of asking people to be less natural, in some ways the great key insight of the Federalists, both on the institutional level in Federalist 51, which we'll come to, and also on the level of society, is don't ask people to be something that nature doesn't make them. Yes, if you've had brothers and sisters, some brothers, like my older brother, I used to think was actually a card-carrying member of the Italian Fascist Party, used to beat me up. But then he mellowed into an adult when the army beat it out of him. The thing is, parents know. You've got to teach, you got to love your brother and sister. In some ways, the great difference between the Anti-Federalists and the Federalists on this question is, can you get a good society just by teaching people to channel their rational self-interest, or do you require them to root their devotion to their society and their country in something which, if it doesn't hide, at least it moderates and covers up the natural selfishness of human beings? This is probably their deepest difference of opinion. And on the page of bottom of 21, it continues this theme. Why the small republic was necessary. On the bottom of 21, the small republic was seen as a school of citizenship as much as a scheme for government. An important part, much more important than we are likely today to remember, of their argument for a federal Bill of Rights was that the educative function of such a document in reminding the citizens of the ends of government and strengthening the attachment to it. That's why, by the way, we're not going to talk too much about the debate over the Bill of Rights in the final Constitution, because that was an important issue. 3 members of the Constitutional Convention actually refused to sign the Constitution because it possessed no Bill of Rights. So, and by the way, you'll see that this is why the concern for civic virtue pushed the Anti-Federalists into embrace of civic religion and the fostering of religious faith, because they did not think citizen virtue could exist without divine sanction and religious habituation. Now, de Tocqueville takes that theme up too, and as we're going to see, if that's the case, the modern world is problematic, because the modern world is pushing masses and masses of human beings further and further away from organized religion. We see it all over the world, where Western modernity, and in fact in the United States, even decade by decade. And this is one, now that's a big question then, as you'll see, which we will raise. And de Tocqueville worried that the evaporation of religion would lead to the death of republican government. Although he doesn't simply despair, and we'll come back to this complicated question. But as you're going to see, the Anti-Federalists thought that not only did the Federalist scheme not only ignore citizen virtue by substituting channeled self-interest for it, both on the institutional level, separation of powers and checks and balances. Ambition must be made to counteract ambition, as Madison says in Federalist 51. But in creating a society in which probably most citizens would be organized into struggling and contending self-interested factions, and they would compete for public policy. So that great question at the founding is exactly the one that Storing says we're still living out today and have throughout American history. So, on page 23, there's a nice statement of this issue. The Constitution and its defenders deliberately turned away from religion as the foundation of civil institutions. Among the Anti-Federalists, on the other hand, there was a great deal of sympathy with the views like those of Charles Turner. Without the prevalence of Christian piety and morals, or biblical, or even Abrahamic, or even piety including both Eastern and Western religions, he expressed a central anti-federal thought when he urged that the new rulers should turn their attention to the task which surpasses the framing of constitutions, of fostering religion and morals, thereby making government less necessary by rendering the people more capable of being a law unto themselves. Such self-government was possible, however, only at the center of gravity American government remained in the states. And so there you have the basic elements of the anti-federal position. Now let's turn to the Federalist position. And to some degree, let me start out with, in Chapter 5, the Federalist Reply. Storing this issue of majority tyranny, of democratic majority tyranny, which Storing considers, by the way, the deepest theoretical superiority of the Federalist position, and that the preference for the small, local, homogeneous community, which Madison rejects in Federalist 10, is that small community can represent the tyranny and ruthlessness of a democratic majority, almost like democracy itself, which, don't forget, that's one of the reasons why the framers rejected direct democracy, because there was no check on the will of the majority. There was nothing in the inherent structure of a democratic society which prevented a trial from descending into a lynch mob. And so in some ways, as you'll see, Storing and the Federalists thought that in the embrace of the small homogeneous community, and what should we look historically to the small homogeneous community? How about all those southern states with white majorities that not only enslaved black people, but after the abolition of slavery, through Jim Crow laws and through segregation and everything, imposed a majority tyranny on them? The great problem of democratic majority tyranny, which again you're going to see that not only is Madison the great theorist of, but de Tocqueville is truly the great modern theorist of that issue. So on the top of page 41, to the Federalists, Henry's, and the other Anti-Federalists view both the problem and the solution miss the main points. Having established the centrality to Republican government of the problem of majority tyranny, the Federalists went on to challenge the Anti-Federalist preference for the small republic in all of the three essential aspects that we have considered. And this, by the way, sets out on the last column on the right all the main arguments. Rather than attempting to secure the patriotic attachment and law-abidingness of citizens through a small republic, the Federalists, in erecting the great national competent federal administration, the Federalists would bind the citizens to their polity by effective government and by good administration. That's the voluntary attachment issue. Rather than trying to secure responsibility through a numerous representation, the Federalists would stress the filtering effect of representation. They would accept the natural leadership of the influential few, attaching it to the government and directing it to the public good through ambition, counteract ambition, the separation of powers, and the checks and balances, which creates a competition among self-interested institutions on the level of government. And finally, rather than trying to foster Republican simplicity and civic virtue, one might say, and self-restraint, the Federalists would rely on the many diverse private gratifications available in the extended republic, with its spaciousness and opportunity to make it unlikely that any faction, and particularly a majority faction, would have the inclination or opportunity to tyrannize over others. So, that, by the way, is the core argument of Federalist 10. So, again, this is a quite different view of what Republican government is. So, on the question of voluntary attachment, the Federalists said, well, people will obey the government if they see it working. And on page 43, there's a nice statement of that. The Federalist view then was that effective government, in addition to being intrinsically desirable, is also the key to the attachment of the people and to civic virtue itself. A government that can actually accomplish its resolves, that can keep the peace, protect property, and promote the prosperity of its citizens, will be a government respected and obeyed by the citizens. It will, moreover, promote private and public morality by providing with effective protection. So, for instance, instead of having a nation of separate warring states raising tariffs with each other and competing economically, a single vigorous national commercial regulation will actually increase prosperity. People will see it. They'll see their private situation improving by virtue of good administration, good roads, good schools, and everything like that. Instead of the shabby failure of the imbecility of the Articles, which people, even if you loved Republican government, you had to wince as you looked at how badly we were governed. So the argument was, rather than an affectionate attachment to an incompetent and ineffectual, broken-down old automobile, a new shiny car will get your affection and respect faster and deeper. And law, this is what I kind of teased out as a second thing. The argument is that law isn't this kind of rational approximation of the common good. It's what we call in the legislative studies log rolling. It's a balance of interests and mutual back scratching. Instead of debating whether a certain tax is good for the whole country because of the common good, if you're a dairy farmer, I'll agree to lower dairy taxes. If I'm a wheat farmer, if you agree to vote for lowering, so none of us looks to the common good. We just bargain, and law is the kind of encapsulated bargain. And by the way, when in my Congress class, that's what a good deal of legislation has become in the modern republic. So anyway, and then the last is, instead of simple government which the people can watch and their sentiments direct, you get, first of all, admit, again, this is the third problem, the ambition of the ambitious. Whereas, in the same way that we saw that in some way the Anti-Federalists wanted to cover up the national selfishness of human beings through a kind of layer of civic morality and devotion to the common good, their hope was, they knew that people running for office are icky, poo-poo, caca, slimy people. And they thought, well, only with a small republic can you kind of contain those slimy people so that they do less harm and actually try to govern. The Federalists said, no. How do you best contain the ambition of the ambition? Let it go. Let them go for it. And instead construct a complex series of institutions, separation of powers, and contending powers that forces the ambitious to struggle with this. This great statement that Madison makes in Federalist 51, this policy of supplying by opposite and rival interests the defect of better motives, which I translate for my American government students as, what's the policy of the Constitution? Instead of trusting gooder motives, better motives, higher motives for the people you elect to office, accept that they're going to be self-interested poops, but then channel the institution so that their self-interest limits the self-interest. That's how you prevent tyranny, which by both the Federalists and Anti-Federalists agreed was the prevention of all concentration in one set of hands. And here's a nice statement of that on 44. Thus, the positive side of the Federalist case for representation is the likelihood that it will produce a government with a capacity to govern well. This probability is increased in an extensive republic, which is more likely to put forward proper guardians of the public weal. Even more talented people, on the premise that talent for governing may go along with ambition for governing. And in people like Hamilton, that might have been true. So you might disagree that the people in Congress are of a better quality, more educated, and more qualified than the people in the state legislatures. But there are some genuine dolts. Well, there are dolts in Congress, too, don't get me wrong. But the percentage of doltosity, you could argue, it's the local yokels who run state legislatures. And believe me, state legislatures pass a bunch of stupid legislation. So, on page 47 is a nice statement of this. James Madison and others saw it as its greatest virtue, the large, diverse republic. In a large, diverse, wealthy country, men can find ample opportunity to gratify their private wants. They will be less likely to resent the success and to encroach the rights of others, and such resentment as they do feel will be less likely to take dangerous political form. The trouble with the Anti-Federalists in this view was that they saw society as a teacher, as a molder of character, rather than as a regulator of conduct. Their mentality was like that expressed in a 1776 proclamation of Massachusetts General Court. Preaching like this, asking people to be better citizens, asking legislators to be better statesmen, preaching like this, whether in the form of direct injunction or the supposed functioning of the small republic, seemed to be the Federalists ineffective or at least grossly efficient. No matter how strong the preaching or the community surveillance, men's interest will not be subdued or governed by considerations of public good, moral duty, or religious salvation. So the Federalists then said of human selfishness, bring it on, encourage it, but if you channel it properly, you can produce the common good. So in some ways that presents the core arguments. So let me summarize with storing. If you're looking at the notes, this is Roman numeral 7 on page 3 of the notes that I passed out earlier this week. So the great debate over the Constitution at the time of the founding concerned two great related questions. What kind of institution should we live under? Confederation versus national union. And what kind of communities, with what kind of way of life should we live in? As Storing argues, the Federalists and Anti-Federalists, remember, shared the same core assumptions about human nature and political life derived from the Declaration of pointing to the preferability of republican government, the first two columns in the comparogram, as the best available political and communal arrangements to secure rights. The one most likely to preserve our natural liberty under the conditions of social and political life, and the one least likely to create tyrannical or corrupt institutions and societies. And both of them, even though they were attached to the principles of the Declaration, also saw in different degrees of clarity tensions and problems within the nation launched by the Declaration. Both admitted that liberty could be problematic as a guiding principle, because people need other important goods too, like order, security, responsible self-government and control, and the habit and ability to grasp and be devoted to the needs of the public, the community, and the common good. Both saw selfishness as natural and to a certain extent a legitimate and useful energy when it also is connected with self-government and community. Here then are the main differences that led to the Federalists preferring the Constitution and the great, diverse, centralized republic that it rested upon and encouraged, and the Anti-Federalists preferring the small, intimate, and participatory republics of the states. For the Anti-Federalists, only the small republic, again, could provide the homogeneous and participatory community that would allow citizens personal liberty at the same time that they would be encouraged and trained by life in that community to care about and understand the needs of others and the public. With a government and laws they supported and understood, governed by leaders whom they also trusted and over whom they retained genuine control and supervision. For the Federalists, only the vast, diverse national republic could provide the institutional restraint in the form of a complex government, with a greater distance from the public opinion that would assure a more effective and competent government that would secure the attachment of the citizenry because it worked better and allowed them to prefer their private interest more effectively. The Anti-Federalists were more skeptical about the simple goodness of self-interest and thought we needed more robust community to restrain it and transform it into real citizenship. They tended to be more trusting in the simple goodness of democracy and majority opinion and ability of public opinion to lead to just and effective government, if the citizenry retained virtuous habits and attitude. The Federalists were more trusting in rational self-interest and the thought that if that energy were channeled properly through well-designed institutions and a prosperous and active commercial society, citizens would not require the kind of virtue and involvement in communal life that the Anti-Federalists thought were a minimum requirement for Republican government. Also, the Federalists were more skeptical about the tendencies of the small, intimate, participatory community to lead to just and effective government, and that it possessed more of a possibility of majority tyranny than the Anti-Federalists grasped or admitted the argument of Federalist attempt. The Federalists won, and the large national republic combined with commerce and mobility, but with some nod in the direction of the small republic, became the template for American life with the debate between those two principles, which you still see, by the way, in contemporary politics. I'm going to read a couple of conclusion, some great statements from the last chapter of Storing that sums up the issue, and then talk about where we are right now in our country and see how Storing's proposition that it's the debate between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists that actually still dominates our politics, and that the small community versus the large national diverse community of self-interest is still an alive issue. Although it is played out in ways that both and neither the Anti-Federalists or the Federalists could see. So this is the question the question about American life that Storing thought the Anti-Federalists saw most clearly on page 73. Can a legal system for the regulation of private passions to the end that those passions may be more fully gratified as the foundation of civic virtue? Montesquieu argued that virtue required in a republican government is the love of law as a country, and that such love requires a constant preference of public to private interest. So, the Anti-Federalists contended that it did not. I'm sorry, back up one sentence. The question is, whether the Constitution as the Federalists understood it succeeded in laying that argument to rest. The Anti-Federalists contended that it did not. So, and by the way, here's a nice image to probably some of you grew up in a small town as opposed to a big city. I've lived in a small town. I grew up on a farm. I've lived in Chicago, Washington, and New York. I lived in both the giant commercial, urban ant heaps of huge cities in America. And of course, there's an argument for both small town life, which is, by the way, the argument for small town life versus big city life is not unlike the great argument between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists. But okay, so maybe you grew up in a small town, you remember mom and pop stores, grocery stores. Which would you rather shop in? Walmart or mom and pop's corner grocery store? And you can see that when you pose it that way, Americans have voted with their feet. The question is the people at Walmart, does simply shopping in a diverse and commercial society which satisfies your every private needs, is that enough to create a citizenry that can last through crisis and turmoil? And we've seen a lot of crisis and turmoil in the last decade, in the last 6 months, and in the last month, for that matter. And so you could say these debates between small, virtuous community and the diverse national system do, in fact, go on. And what we'll do in a couple of instances is see how American politics has reflected both an embrace of anti-federalist aims and federalist means and ends, too. And that, as we'll see. Now, for our next topic, we will turn to the problematic question of slavery in the founding, in the Wilentz book, and in the second Storing article.